Greetings and welcome to this session at the Center for Global Development looking at the outlook for 2021. The World Bank has just produced its Global Economic Prospects report, and in what's become a little bit of a tradition, we have with us now Ehan Ghosh, who's the acting vice president for economic policy in the World Bank. And Ehan is going to make a presentation of the report. And then we have a very distinguished group of panelists who are going to provide their perspective. We have, I'm looking at my screen and just in the order in which the pictures appear on my screen, which may be different from yours, Anne-Marie Gould. Anne-Marie has been on the same conversation earlier on when she was working on Africa, but Anne-Marie's now been working at the IMF on Asia Pacific, and it'll be very interesting to get her views on that region, which, as we'll discover, has done better than many others during this crisis. Liliana Rojas Suarez, who is, of course, a senior fellow here at CGD and directs our Latin America initiative. And Liliana is going to talk about emerging markets and about Latin America in particular, which in a bit of a contrast to what Anne-Marie's focus is actually a region that has done not well at all and poses a lot of strains. And then Dauda Sembene, who's a distinguished non-resident fellow here at CGD and has also until recently been the economic advisor to the president of Senegal, has a long and distinguished career. And Dauda will be able to bring us a perspective, particularly on the prospects for Africa. I'm not going to steal Ehan's thunder and let him make his presentation now, but you know, Ehan, it's a pretty somber reading, the global economic prospects this year. You know, the two things that struck me when I read it, and I'm sure you'll go into greater depth on both, is one, when you look at the next couple of years and look at the emerging markets and developing countries, if you leave aside China, basically we're talking about 3.5% a year growth rates for 2021-22, which is nothing to write home about. And if you look further out, you know, the phrase you used in the report that we run the risk of ending up with a decade of disappointments, that really sort of resonated with me because in a way, then the challenge becomes, can we do anything to try and avoid those disappointments going forward? So I'm sure we'll have a very interesting conversation. And without further ado, Ehan, can I turn to you? You're going to take about 15 minutes to walk us through the report, and then we'll open it up to our panelists.
Thank you, Masoud. Good afternoon, colleagues. It's always a privilege to come to Center for Global Development. And we greatly appreciate Masoud and his colleagues for supporting our work and providing this platform. Today, I'm going to talk about this report we released January 6th. I will quickly show you some slides. So you can see my slides on the screen. Excellent. The report we issued in January and June looks at the state of the global economy, focuses on emerging market and developing economies. In addition to global and regional outlooks, this report focuses on three analytical issues. The first one is, of course, the debt problem and how the pandemic made this debt problem worse. The second one is the one Masoud alluded to. What should we expect in the coming decades in terms of growth prospects? And the third one What are the implications of asset purchase programs a number of emerging market economies employ? I will briefly summarize the main insights from the report. To structure the conversation, I'm going to focus on three questions. First, what are near-term growth prospects? Second, how has the pandemic worsened growth prospects for the 2020s? And third, what are policy priorities? We have this acronym EMDs that stands for Emerging Market and Developing Economies, and I will use that throughout the presentation. Let me start with the first question. What are near-term growth prospects? The most important determinant of growth is the status of the pandemic. Unfortunately, there has been a sharp rise in the number of new COVID cases in recent months. You can see here in these figures that there are significant outbreaks in many parts of the world, particularly in advanced economies, in Europe, Central Asia region, and Latin America and the Caribbean. The resurgence of the pandemic has naturally led a slowdown in economic activity and to a renewal of mitigation measures that were being relaxed in many countries over the summer. Global growth in the first quarter of last year, of course, was going to be affected, but we are not expecting the kind of contraction seen in the second quarter of last year, partly because control measures have become better targeted and less economically disruptive. The fact that our forecasts incorporate this fairly recent surge in infections is one of the reasons many of our projections are downgraded. It's also one of the reasons that our report emphasizes the near-term importance of controlling the virus. There has been some good progress on the vaccine front, but that doesn't mean that other control measures can be abandoned. Until vaccines are widely distributed, it's difficult to see a sustained recovery in growth. So what do these basically messages tell us about near-term growth prospects? After a severe contraction of 4.3% last year, global growth is expected to bounce back to 4% in 2021. And easing of pandemic allows governments to gradually relax pandemic control measures, and activity comes back. So that is good news. If you look at advanced economies, growth is expected to strengthen to 3.3%. In the United States and Japan, recently announced fiscal support packages will help support activity. For emerging market developing economies, growth looks quite robust, around 5% if you look at the aggregate. But much of that strength is due to a strong recovery in China. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. When you look at regions, you see that East Asia Pacific was able to deliver growth last year. All other regions pretty much contracted and actually registered historical contractions. This year, East Asia and Pacific, on the back of China, is going to grow around 7.4%, and we upgraded our forecast for the region. But when you look at Europe, Central Asia, Middle East, North Africa, and especially Sub-Saharan Africa, we downgraded our growth forecast for this year. So all in all, we have a heterogeneous picture, but the growth prospects after this deep contraction are subdued. Even by the end of 2021, global output is going to be 5.3% lower than what we projected prior to the pandemic. Now, I mentioned this growth number, 5% for emerging market developing economies for 2021. That's mostly driven by China. If you take out China, that growth number actually goes down to 3.4%. In the case of low-income economies, growth again is around 3%, coming back somewhat around 5.5% next year. If you look at on the right, you will see how forecasts changed. For 2021, we had many of countries, the majority of them, were subject to growth downgrades. In the case of advanced economies, in fact, those downgrades apply to 80% of them. In the case of emerging market developing economies, around 70% of countries were subject to downgrade. So all in all, yes, growth is coming back. It's a subdued recovery. And as Masoud mentioned at the beginning, growth is going to remain mostly around 3.5% for emerging market developing economies, excluding China. In the report, we emphasize one important development we need to keep in mind. After a period of persistent weakness, investment collapsed last year. That collapse in the emerging market developing economies was about 4%. But if you take out China, it was around 11%. So considering these economies actually were able to deliver positive investment growth during the global financial crisis, this collapse was truly a huge, huge disappointment. Going forward, we are projecting investment is not coming back to the levels we had in 2019, even at the end of 2022. This is critical. Why? Because investment is one of the most important determinants of potential growth. Risks going forward are still tilted to the downside. The most important risk is the intensification of the pandemic and, of course, delayed vaccine deployment. We are still worried about financial stress as well because of elevated levels of public debt as well as corporate debt. And there, of course, these forbearance measures delay the bankruptcies, but we might end up seeing a wave of corporate bankruptcies in these countries when these forbearance measures removed. Over the medium and long term, the single most important risk is larger than expected decline in potential growth, which I am going to talk soon. Let me briefly talk about the debt dynamics. Prior to the pandemic, emerging market and developing economies were going through the largest, most synchronized, and fastest accumulation of debt wave we have seen in modern times. That wave now turned into a tsunami. At the global level, we have basically close to 100% relative to GDP debt. In the case of emerging market developing economies, we saw the largest jump in debt levels since the late 1980s, when these economies had a series of financial crises. When you look at debt to revenue ratios, of course, those ratios skyrocketed. So there is a serious problem of basically servicing debt. And these numbers apply to all emerging market developing economies. Even if you take out China, China is, of course, account for a large fraction of output as well as debt. This debt wave is extraordinary. One important pocket we need to focus on in the context of debt challenges in low-income countries. When you look at debt levels relative to GDP, they went up significantly. Of course, last year, countries were employing fiscal measures. They required them to accumulate additional debt. But if you look at the debt to revenue ratios, last year we saw a 100 percentage points increase. So debt is not just higher, debt service capacity has become much lower because, of course, the output is much weaker and is going to remain weak for the foreseeable future. And at the same time, the biggest problems we are seeing in the context of debt are in fragile low-income countries. Those are the countries that have much larger challenges other than that. Now, let me mention one important risk we are also focusing on. A number of emerging market developing economies, for the first time in history, employed asset purchase programs to stabilize their financial markets. These programs were much lower than what we saw in advanced economies. relative to the GDP of these economies. And the first approximation, these programs work. They bought assets and they were able to stabilize their financial markets. There were significant declines in bond yields. Of course, it's difficult to isolate the importance of these programs in stabilizing financial markets in an environment you have basically major central banks providing unprecedented accommodation and liquidity. Why are we worried about asset purchases in emerging market developing economies? Because in the past, these types of programs in these economies basically used to finance deficits, especially when central banks went and bought these assets in primary markets. Now, going forward, this does not necessarily mean that they will do the same. These economies have stronger policy frameworks, but they need to make sure they have well-defined policies in terms of duration of asset purchase programs, the scope of asset purchase programs, and of course, objectives of these programs. Let me turn to the second question. How has the pandemic worsened growth prospects for the 2020s? Before the pandemic, we thought that potential growth was already slowing around the world because of a number of headwinds. Investment was slowing, productivity was slowing, and of course, the slowdown deepened. In the case of investment, there was a collapse. Now, it's not just physical investment, human capital investment was impeded because of the pandemic. Millions of school-age kids couldn't go to school, couldn't acquire the type of knowledge they used to acquire under normal circumstances. This will have implications, of course, accumulation of human capital at the national level. Prior to the pandemic, we thought that potential growth in 2020s will be around 4% in these countries. It was 5% in 2010s. So we expected around 1 percentage points decline. Now we are expecting actually in 2020s, on average potential growth is going to be around 3.5%. So the ability to generate growth in 2020s will be weaker. And this weakness applies to pretty much all regions, wherever you look at. Now, there is another way of thinking about the growth prospects as we think of 2020s. Long-term growth expectations were weakening before the pandemic. For example, we thought that emerging market developing economies could generate growth at around 6% in 2010, 10 years ahead. So we were looking at the ability of these economies to generate growth 10 years ahead. We thought, okay, they could deliver 6% growth. Now that number went down to 4%. Of course, what happens when you have these types of deep recessions, these types of long-term growth expectations experience further downgrades. We saw that after the global financial crisis, how there were short-term growth disappointments and eventually growth expectations downgraded. Of course, long-term growth expectations are critical for investment decisions and consumption decisions. That's why we are thinking that unless policymakers intervene and provide the type of support necessary, we might be in for a decade of growth disappointments. Let me turn to the third question. What are policy priorities? Here, of course, still the near-term issue is supporting healthcare systems. Now, we were worried about whether there will be a vaccine available soon. Now we have an answer to that question. There are vaccines available, some of them are quite effective. The question then, whether authorities can accelerate vaccine deployment through global coordination and basically immunize a very large chunk of national populations as well as the global population. That will be the critical issue, the vaccination and getting basically the activity back to normal levels. Given the collapse in activity, though, there is this issue of still protecting the poor and vulnerable, strengthening social safety nets, provided coordinated debt relief to poorest emerging market developing economies. We shouldn't resort to kick the can down the road measures of debt restructuring at this point. We need to find durable solutions to debt challenges these low-income countries are facing. And we don't need to go back far. We learned the lessons from the 80s and 90s. If we have short-term, basically solutions to these debt problems, these debt problems become larger. Beyond that, of course, we need to think about how we can make sure potential growth is not going to decline in the way we are projecting right now. That one requires serious institutional reforms and at the same time, of course, preserving financial stability. With this pandemic, it's clear we need to enhance digital infrastructure. And I think pandemic also tells us the climate-related challenges are critical for the livelihood of millions around the world and for the feasibility of a kind of life we are expecting on Earth. Improving education is going to be critical to reverse these losses because of the pandemic, and coordinating policies at the global level to address these global challenges, including climate change, trade disputes, financial disputes, going to be critical. And let's make no mistake, reforms do pay off. If we can bring higher investment, if we can bring more female into labor force, the woman, and if we can improve the health and education outcomes, we can mitigate the slowdown in potential growth. And when governments implement these types of policies, financial markets reward them by upgrading long-term growth forecasts. Let me conclude. I asked three questions. First, what are near-term growth prospects? We are expecting a subdued global recovery in 2021. We had forecast downgrades in most emerging market developing economies and low-income countries. Risks are still tilted to the downside. Second, how has the pandemic worsened growth prospects for the 2020s? We were expecting a slowdown in potential growth. Now we are thinking there is going to be even a more pronounced potential growth slowdown. And there's the possibility of another decade of repeated growth disappointments. Third question, what are policy priorities against this, somber outlook? We need to address the health crisis. We need to protect the poor. We need to find ways to ease the debt burdens. Beyond that, it's high time for policymakers to undertake the types of reforms necessary to basically generate a business environment, to basically generate institutional environment that's going to support robust, sustainable, equitable growth. And global cooperation is going to be critical to attain the types of outcomes we are looking at. I would like to invite you all to visit our webpage and look at our publications, including Global Economic Prospects. We have a number of analytical studies you might find useful. Let me stop here. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ehan. That was very clear, crisp messages are coming through. And I think it gives us a very nice basis for a conversation. And I'm going to start with Anne-Marie, if I may turn to you first, please. Tell us a little bit about how the world looks from the East Asia and Pacific perspective. We saw the numbers, your region is doing better than every other region. But we also know that within that region, there are some countries, whether we're talking about the Philippines or even Malaysia, which have been harder hit. And also sometimes people forget in looking at the big countries that East Asia also has a number of small Pacific islands. And for them, the pandemic and the impact through tourism has been extraordinary. And their prospects are very challenged by by climate change. So a little bit of how should we think about the East Asia picture?
Thank you so much, Masood, for the invitation. Good afternoon to all. Let me start by congratulating Ayan and his team on a really very interesting report, and also on the choice of the very appropriate choice of the analytical chapters. We really address the key challenges we are facing right now. So those of you who know the fund and the IMF and the bank know that the IMF also has a publication of economic forecasts, the World Economic Outlook, which will only be released later in January. So I unfortunately cannot really comment on country-specific numbers, but what I can do and want to do is to talk about recent developments and the likely implications for the outlook. And in doing so, just as a caveat, we all have to recognize that forecasting under the current circumstances is marked by an extreme level of uncertainty given the nature and the depth of the shock. We should therefore not be surprised that data revisions can exceed what we normally would have seen or expected. So there may be, a slight nuance of difference from what Ayan has just mentioned in looking at our October forecast and what we see in terms of the most recently released economic data for several of the regions. So third quarter GDP did surprise on the upside in some countries. I would point to Australia, the Euro area, India, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, the United States. So that is good news. Then recent vaccine approvals have, of course, improved hopes for a turnaround of the pandemic later this year, together with sizable fiscal support announced in some countries, including most recently the US and Japan. This should help lift economic activity among advanced economies, with then eventually some favorable spillovers to trading partners. But as Ayan also stressed, there are significant downside risks, new waves of infections in many countries, new variants of the disease developing, slow vaccine rollout, all are downside risks that we realize. But in terms of the overall direction, we still see most likely an upgrades in part of the world compared to our October forecast. Now let me turn to Asia, the region, as you mentioned, that I cover in the IMF. An overarching message on Asia is a high degree of divergence and differences within sub-regions. So as was mentioned by Ayan and by you, East Asia and Pacific offer a relatively positive picture. Those were the countries that are now emerging from the crisis, most with positive growth in 2020. The reasons for this relatively strong performance include an early public health response, relaxing containment measures really only after the virus had been suppressed, and importantly, significant fiscal and monetary policy support to reduce economic costs and underpin the recovery. By contrast, the picture in South Asia has been less positive. India is the largest economy in the region, and it faced severe downward pressures on growth even before entering the COVID crisis. And, picking up on the theme that Ayan also mentioned, so the interaction between COVID and other structural challenges was particularly evident in the case of India. So the starting point, the depth of the crisis, and a very strict lockdown and initially limited fiscal policy support led to the most severe recession among Asian economies. Smaller South Asian economies have also been more heavily affected than those in East Asia, reflecting both differences in starting conditions, limited policy space for support, and possibly less well organized initial policy and healthcare responses. We now see somewhat more reason for optimism than the numbers that are reflected in the Global Economic Prospects report. For this reason, however, as well, following the end of the lockdown, recent data releases, especially again for India, show increased mobility and increased economic activity. We have therefore expect lesser decline in output for fiscal 2021 than our October VO and a stronger rebound in the following 2 years. But this notwithstanding, it is a very, very severe recession that we see in the region. Looking toward the medium term now, I agree that scarring is likely unless decisive policy action is taken. Speaking again mainly for Asia, we are concerned about three main risks. Because of weak global growth, closed borders, and festering tensions around trade, technology, security issues in the region. So the region will not be able to count exclusively on trade-led growth. Diversifying Asia's economies away from over-reliance on export, however, will take time and is particularly difficult in the countries that you just mentioned, the Masood, in the smaller and tourist-dependent economies. Further rising inequality could also threaten particularly sustainable and inclusive recovery in the region. What we have as evidence is that women and younger workers have already suffered more job losses than what we have seen in the global financial crisis. And as you know, redistributive policies in Asia so far are limited because of the large informal sector, and there are increasing policy challenges to reach and support the most vulnerable. And then the question of debt that was mentioned very rightly in the report. So high indebtedness in the Asia region makes it particularly vulnerable to financial turbulence. A renewed bout of tighter financial conditions could worsen credit risk and financial stability, aggravate weak public and private sector balance sheets, and potentially push vulnerable countries into a debt crisis. So some countries with high pre-COVID debt levels have by now also lost market access, and debt sustainability concerns complicate engagements of IFIs with some of the weakest countries. This group in Asia is admittedly small still, but each of the individual cases underlines the need to accelerate multilateral efforts toward improving a debt resolution framework. In this context, I just want to emphasize the importance of operationalizing the G20 common framework and finding a way to ensure private participation in debt workouts for lasting progress. So before closing, let me again note that the choice of the topics for the analytical chapters is very appropriate. As I mentioned already, the debt clearly an overarching concerns for many regions. In chapter 3, taking an early look at the possible long-term effects of the pandemic puts the focus on policy measures that are needed now to minimize and avoid longer-term output losses. I just can say that the IMF will also look at related questions in the upcoming VO, which will have a chapter on related topics, focusing a bit more on advanced countries and labor market issues that are posed in advanced countries. And then chapter 4, the non-conventional monetary policy in emerging markets and developing countries. We hear from many from many member countries, policymakers and central bankers show significant interest, but the jury, as also I take from the report, on the longer term impact for countries with less well-established institutional credibility remains outstanding, and shining a light and doing further analytical and empirical work will be crucial to guide this debate. With this, again, let me thank you for the invitation and really underscore that this is an important report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. So we'll come back to some of the questions that you've raised once we've had the other panelists. And let me turn to Liliana. And Liliana, on Latin America, one of the things that Arhan put up was if you looked at the potential growth numbers and how they were being downgraded, if I recall right, the lowest number for the medium-term growth projections was really in Latin America. And it didn't already start from a very high number, but now it's the lowest. And also this issue that Anne-Marie finished on, which is on the unconventional asset purchase programs of central banks. Latin America has been leading the way a little bit on that also. So it'd be interesting to get a bit your take on the region, which seems to be struggling quite a lot with the near term and then also the medium term prospects.
Yes, thank you so much, Masood, for that question. And thank you, Ahan, so much for a great report, as always, once again this year. Masood, indeed, yes, a number of Latin American countries are amongst the most hit in the world. And when you mentioned in Latin America, there is one country that have actually the lowest decline in growth. Unfortunately, it's my country, Peru. So I'm not very happy about that statistics. So the strongest contraction among emerging markets, -7%, according to the World Bank report, happened in Latin America. Now, there are a number of reasons for that outcome, but I would like to underline two. First, extremely weak initial conditions in the region and some very important initial deficiencies in the policy response. This didn't really have to happen as bad as it did in Latin America. On the policy response, a major mistake by some large countries has been the refusal at the presidential level, including Mexico and Brazil, large economies, to acknowledge the severity of the problem. So misleading information and unnecessary social divisions have followed. And this really constrains the limits of regional authorities and other policymakers to implement effective solutions. But the major reason behind the poor outcome in Latin America is largely related to what was done or was not done during the pre-COVID years. The initial conditions were extremely weak in the regions at the outbreak of the pandemic. Although some countries had some macroeconomic indicators, such as low inflation, large accumulation of reserves, the region was showing anemic growth since 2014, when the period of the commodity boom ended. Basically, what happened in Latin America is that it lost the external motors of growth. So basically, Latin America had to face its own constraints for growth. And Latin America has been having very low ratios of savings and investment. And as Ahan mentioned, sharp decline in total factor productivity. So in that situation, the gap of income per capita in the region relative to the comparable income in advanced economies was really widening. So the gap towards development was widening in Latin America. Pre-COVID, Latin America was underperforming, and investments in critical sectors such as health, education, and infrastructure were lagging dramatically. So in addition, in most countries, almost all indications of institutional quality was showing very weak results, with government's capacity to implement projects and reforms amongst the most efficient. So lack of adequate provision of public services, inflexible labor markets, and low institutional qualities combine to produce a degrees of informality of workers and firms that surpass more than 50% of the labor force in a number of countries such as Mexico and Colombia, and reach over 70% in my own country, Peru. So when COVID hit the region, the pandemic exacerbated existing fragilities. The severe deficiencies that already were there in health infrastructure made it impossible to effectively deal with the problems. Central banks' liquidity stimulus, happened, and the asset purchase program that you mentioned were actually done in Latin America, hopefully in most of the countries, in the secondary market, not in the primary markets. So there has not been large financing of fiscal deficit yet. Yet. Depending on fiscal space, there was also a number of fiscal expansions, including transfer to support the most vulnerable populations, but lacking a strong capacity of implementation, something that is not going to be resolved in the near future at all. Transfers not always reached those that need the most. So stories about long lines to cash these transfers in countries with large proportions of unbanked populations were very common in the region. These lines would, of course, propagate the disease even further. So when you have economies that basically are fueled by lack of government capacity to put in place effective mechanisms for testing and tracing, lockdowns and informality created a vicious circle. Some Latin American countries are among those with the longest period of strict lockdowns in the world. Actually, I believe that Argentina holds the record as the country with the longest lockdown in the region, in the world, not in the region, in the world. But the large segments of informal population, unwilling or unable to follow the strict lockdown due to the lack of social protection mechanism, was a huge constraint for the effectiveness of the lockdowns. At the same time, the strict lockdowns resulted in the cease, in the paralyzation of economic activities in many firms, and the consequent large losses of formal jobs, which in turn push even more population into informality. So this is the vicious circle I'm talking about. So not surprisingly, output has declined so severely in the region, and given the permanent loss of income and jobs, it will really take a very long time to recover. Just to finalize, if one looks for something good, well, it's interesting that China growth is helping because commodity prices, Latin America is a commodity exporter region, highly concentrated, and in some metals like copper, for example, and those prices are increasing significantly. This is very interesting because China actually came to the rescue during the global financial crisis and can actually come back again in the case of Latin America. Let me stop here now.
Thank you very much, Liliana. We'll come back to the question of China maybe and its role in different ways. And also this point you made about the lockdowns and how they worked and how feasible they were for economies where large numbers of people work in the informal sector, don't have a savings pool to dip into, there's no effective safety net. I mean, I think it's even almost a year after the pandemic started, we have enough evidence to sort of say what kinds of lockdown measures don't work, but we're still struggling to be able to advise a country on what is the right mix of measures that would work given the structure of the economies they face. So that's a very important point that you've raised, which we can come back to. I want to turn Daouda to you now. When the pandemic started, many people came up with projections of its impact the health impact on Africa and African countries. And then as time went by, it turned out that the actual immediate direct health impact was not as bad as many people had initially thought. And on the other hand, the economic impact started showing up in different countries. And so here we are now, as I said, almost 11 months, 10 months after. It's also clear that the international response to helping African countries that didn't have market access or had very high debt levels to start with has been inadequate, to say the least. And now we look out at the prospects for next year, and I think sub-Saharan growth numbers were kind of under 3%, if I recall right, 2 point something, which in a given population growth rates in the many of the countries in the continent really means stagnating incomes for yet another year or two. In many countries that already started off on a path where they were deviating quite significantly from what was needed to make progress towards the sustainable development goals for 2030. So I want to get a little bit kind of your sense now on how you see the situation now looking forward. And Ayhan ended on this sort of, the policy package. Is that policy package feasible, doable? Will it have an impact in the region? Sorry, that's a big agenda, but you're the man to help us address it.
Well, thank you very much, Masood. It's good to be with you and other colleagues and friends. Allow me, before I respond to your question, maybe to share with you 3 takeaways that I actually have from Ayhan, very interesting and very informative presentation. I think the first takeaway, and I think actually everyone would agree with him, is that I guess the global economic recovery is going to be very subdued. It is clear that the global output in 2021 is going to be much below pre-pandemic level, and this is something that unfortunately we have to live with. And there is so much uncertainty right now about the outlook that is clear that it will be important going forward to find a way to address downside risk to growth and make sure that we can easily bolster recovery. And downside risk, I guess, key among them is, as Ayhan said, the ineffective vaccine rollout, and this is something that certainly needs to be addressed as soon as possible, so that the global economy can recover fully and rapidly. Unfortunately, as we have seen, and as the report points out, I guess more than 100 million people around the world have fallen into extreme poverty as a result of the shock due to the pandemic, and this is certainly very dramatic. And the sooner policy priorities that are actually advocated are implemented, the better for maximizing the likelihood for getting out of the crisis. The second takeaway that I actually have from the presentation is the fact that, yes, the compounding risk associated with debt buildup is gonna be likely to result, of course, from the pandemic, and it's gonna be going forward increasingly dangerous. And certainly, I think before even the pandemic hit, there was some increasing debt buildup that was quite important, I think, for emerging market and developing economies. If I'm not mistaken, the report say that it has been debt has been increasing by 7 to 9 percentage points a year, and after the crisis, it increased by 9 percentage points. So that's quite a huge number, and I think it's it's clear that these risks associated with debt buildup needs to be addressed and hopefully overcome as soon as possible, so that so as to maximize the prospect for economic recovery. One last takeaway I also actually need to share with my fellow panelists is the fact that, of course, global cooperation is going to be needed to address all these challenges related to pandemic management, but also related to debt buildup. And certainly it's going to require that all actors, whether from a rich and a poor country, be able to voice their concern, but also actually it's going to require also that the private sector also join public officials in responding to the crisis. So that being said, I believe you're certainly right, Masood. The crisis has hit the African economy very hard. I think it's going to be the deepest contraction on record that has been estimated to have occurred in Africa in 2020. And the reason is the pandemic-induced crisis has affected economy through various channels. First of all, of course, because of the sharp decline in oil price and demand, many African oil exporters have been registering very deep contraction in output. It's also it's worth noting that tourism-dependent countries in Africa has been also very much impacted by the crisis due to the lockdown measures, but also the shutdown related activities. And I think one thing that needs also to be noted is the fact that unfortunately the pandemic is going to set back previous poverty reduction gain that was noted in the region before the pandemic. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the report is actually estimating that many tens of millions of people in Africa will be falling into extreme poverty, which is very dramatic and which requires from policymakers to take quick actions to strengthen, to protect, of course, the most vulnerable and the poor, and make sure that they to also protect and save life. But I guess not everything has been negative in Africa. And I think it's worth noting that 1 out of 4 sub-Saharan African countries managed to avoid a contraction last year. And I think it's mostly those agricultural commodity exporters that were able to stay in positive territory when it comes to growth performance. It's also important to note that there is the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is, I guess, on the table, and hopefully which upon being enacted will help, I guess, to bolster prospect for economic recovery. But I guess one thing that will be certainly important in Africa, I guess, is the fact that the pandemic needs to be managed so to maximize the prospect for economic recovery. And for that, I guess there should be some concerted effort at the global level to make sure that there is equitable and timely access to vaccines. This is certainly not necessarily not the case yet so far. There has been some efforts to help low-income countries and developing countries in general as part of COVAX to get the access to vaccine. But this is certainly not yet happening, and it's not expected to happen before at least the second quarter of this year. And even if it comes, it might not come in adequate numbers to ensure that the virus is completely overcome in the region. And so long as, of course, that's not the case, chances are the global economy will continue, of course, to be exposed to risk of virus resurgence from those countries that have not been able to benefit from adequate access to vaccine.
Thank you very much.
So,
Okay, so maybe you can have a little bit of conversation around some specific issues. And the first one I want to pose to you is really maybe start with Ehan on this, is think a bit about downside risks. So in a way we have a set of an outlook. The outlook doesn't look very good to start with. But you said that downside risks dominate, and now they just raised what was a very serious near-term downside risk, which is that on the basis of what we're seeing so far, it's not obvious that you're going to get this rollout of vaccines in most parts of the world over the next 12 months, and it may actually be 2 years. If you remember, there was a piece of work done by some colleagues in CGD using modeling based on sort of vaccine development expertise, and suggested that it might be another 2 or 3 years before we could say that everybody's got that. So my question, that's kind of one big near-term downside risk. But I guess my question really to all of you is, how is that going to impact what we are saying about the economic recovery? Is it something that we've sort of built into the recovery, that there's going to be partial rollout and there could be an improvement from the baseline, or is that something we should be worried about in terms of a downside to the recovery as we are now thinking about it? And the second big source of downside risk, I think all of you have touched upon it, is really this very large and looming debt set of issues in quite a few countries, not only the poorest countries, but also in some emerging markets. And so far we've had a little bit of a piecemeal approach to dealing with it. Now looking forward, we have this G20 sponsored common framework that could help us do better. So, but it may not quite pan out as effectively as we think. And again, how is that likely to affect our outlook and growth projections? So maybe I'll start with you, Ayhan, and then if other colleagues have any thoughts on that, they could chip in on that too.
Thank you, Mesut. We have been talking about this really subdued outlook, subdued growth prospects. As much as we emphasize that, let's cherish the fact that there is growth, and that's good news. Yes, it's not at the level we were hoping, but growth came back. Now, having said that, let me immediately turn to the question you ask. What does it mean if we do not have the type of vaccine mobilization we are thinking about? And of course, we also need to think about whether these policies, the mitigation measures, are working in the way we were hoping. Liliana mentioned this, you mentioned this issue. Now, in June, when we were having this conversation, we were worried about timely availability of vaccines, but we did not discuss this second wave. We did not think about, oh, the second wave would come and it would be very aggressive. Here we are, there is second wave, there are new strains, much more aggressive. So there is the ability of the policymakers to deploy the vaccine, and we are seeing certain hiccups there. I'm hoping that those hiccups are going to be ironed out, and we will have very huge the type of war mentality mobilization of vaccine in advanced economies first, and then major emerging market developing economies. And by the end of this year, those economies are going to be in good shape, and hopefully sometime middle of next year, we will see a number of countries, significant fraction of population vaccinated. Of course, there is this, the vaccine hesitancy as well. When you go out and ask people, 40% of say, no, I'm not going to get vaccinated. That's a challenge too. Now, with that downside risk in mind, we might have growth if the vaccine mobilization doesn't work in the way we were hoping now. And of course, we have this very aggressive wave still around for the foreseeable future. We might see growth going down below 2 this year. So
you're talking global growth.
Global growth, yes, global growth. We said, 4, we might go down below 2. And the second issue, the debt issue, is critical. The crisis started as a health crisis, turned into an economic crisis. If it turns into a financial crisis, and it's not just the debt problem on the sovereign side, the debt problem on the corporate side is very, very challenging. In an environment you see, ample liquidity, unprecedented forbearance measures, moratoriums of debt payments, sooner or later, these are not going to be there. And we will really see who can survive, who cannot survive. And there we might have all types of challenges. And of course, this type of low interest rate, ample liquidity environment masks all types of problems and keep them under the carpet. And those problems can manifest themselves very rapidly in emerging developing economies. If that happens, we might end up with even a contraction this year. We discussed these issues, these scenarios in detail in the report. I think Ana Maria alluded this point. Forecasting is even more difficult under this environment, so we need to think about these scenarios. And your question, I think, was right on target. With respect to resolution of the debt problem, the IMF and the World Bank pushed to kind of the debt suspension initiative. Of course, we will work with G20 members and our colleagues at the IMF in the context of common framework, but we need to really keep the lessons from history and don't try to implement this band-aid solutions. When the debt problems are there, if you don't have enough growth, these problems will become larger. You can try to intervene here and there, but at some point you need to get in, you need to reduce the debt level, give relief, and move on. And in the context of low-income countries, really global community cannot afford having another decade. In the 80s and 90s, it was 2 decades of low or contractionary growth numbers. So there are solutions, and those solutions will require leadership and immediate action. And of course, at the World Bank, we are ready to help. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Ahan, and thank you for getting into this issue of the corporate debt problem, because I don't think that enough people are thinking about the sort of banking crises that could come when a lot of those corporates have difficulties paying back the loans they've taken from the banks. The banks end up with balance sheet problems, and we know from history that those banking crises are, first of all, they end up becoming public cost, because no matter who owns the debt to start with, it ends up being socialized at the end. And secondly, resolving them can take time and take a lot of resources. So thank you for flagging that point as well. But other colleagues on downside risks. Anybody else want to come in on this? Liliana, you look like you want to say something.
Yes, on both of your questions, on the vaccines, right? For Latin America, I am very, very concerned. In some countries, purchases or actually signatures of contracts for the vaccines don't even reach 20% of the population at this stage. So not even covering a significant percentage of the population. And remember that I mentioned in my first intervention that one of the major problems in Latin America was precisely the problems with the lack of capacity of implementation. So once again, this is going to come as a major constraint in 2001, and certainly is going to affect the region very badly. On the point of corporate debt, I also would like to make the point, as you know, we had a report for Latin America that was alerting about problems that could arise because of financial weakness, right? And Asia basically stressed the importance of helping viable firms. But of course, in times of uncertainty, who's viable and who's not is not that easy. So on assisting viable firms, a program that has been very used extensively in the world, but also in Latin America, has been guarantee programs to support credit. Now, in some countries, the announced programs have been sizable, but to minimize the potential fiscal cost of these guarantees and to ensure that banks have skin in the game, guarantees have been partial. And as a result of that, many banks facing the potential risk actually have decided not to take up on the guarantees, right? So in any event, as mentioned by the World Bank report, corporate debt has been increasing significantly in the pre-pandemic years. So loan guarantee programs might not be the right solution to support many firms, since more debt cannot solve the problems of highly indebted debt already. Also, for the large number of very small firms, not only in Latin America, but in many other emerging markets and developing countries, many of them informal and lacking banking relations or credit histories, guarantee loans will be of limited use, right? Depending on fiscal space, a grant is much better and should be highly monitored, because if the firm becomes not viable, then it's not a good instrument anymore. You have to morph that to transfer to support families as opposed to support firms. But the important one, I think, important conclusion that we have for multilateral organizations is that there are instruments that are not being used for emerging markets that could be used with the support of multilateral organization, and that is the use of equity or equity-like instruments. Because at times of uncertainty, equity is much better than debt.
Yeah.
But of course, providing for equity injections is very risky, and there is a huge role for the public sector arm of multilateral organizations, such as the IDB Invest or the IFC. I mean, there is a big role there, and this is something that could be promoted during this year to help emerging markets put their economic recovery in place.
We can have a whole seminar, which I think we should at some point, around what are the different instruments for actually helping with the recovery that the international system can use. And the point you've just made, which is that most of the international system is organized around loans or grants, and only a small part is around guarantees or risks or equity, is something that maybe is in the right mix for now, and then we come back to that. But I want to get other perspectives on it. I know we're running out of time actually soon. So Anne-Marie, can I come to you?
Masood, yeah, thank you. Maybe I wanted to also make a comment on both of the points that you raised. First, on vaccines, totally agree that the vaccine is a critical element in the forward-looking expectations on where things are going. And I think there we have to recognize that it's especially for the two big Asian economies, things are easier than for others. Both China and India are major pharmaceutical producers. Both have developed their own vaccines in addition to India being able to produce the AstraZeneca vaccine. India has also a history of very successful mass inoculation programs. So I think those are two bright spots in terms of things. I mean, interesting to see that the vaccines now are also used for, vaccine diplomacy in terms of who aligns behind which country. An interesting development. But in terms of the economic prospects, I mean, it is important that those vaccines are being used and are being distributed also to the poorer countries in the region and globally. And India and China, I think, are key in order to ensure that the vaccine is developed and produced also for low-income countries. On the corporate debt, I could not agree with you more that this risks to eventually spill over to the banking system. And again, I want to emphasize that a number, especially of emerging markets, had some issues in banking systems. So we're starting out with weak banking systems, additional credit expanded. There were also policy measures that were very right in terms of debt moratorium, but it's been built up, and the financial system implications of where we stand right now need to be taken into account, and plans developed before you get to a financial weakness and banking crisis situation. All right, so let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. And I want to come to Dauda in case, Dauda, if you have any thoughts on this. But just to say that, I mean, colleagues like Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff have done work on previous banking crises, and all of you, and Erhan, your recent been doing some work on it as well. I mean, the evidence we have from banking crises is that resolving them is a multi-year operation. And also, you almost never get it right on the first time. You have multiple goals at what you think you're fixing, and you live with it for many years to come. And so if you're worried about long-term growth rates, having a banking sector crisis in a number of countries would actually bring those growth numbers down even more, because it's like a drag that just stays with you for so many years. But we, as we said, Liliana, we should organize another event on that. But I want to come to Dauda and say, Dauda, any thoughts that you have on downside risks that you see, particularly for Africa?
Well, thank you, Masood. I'm going to actually start with the vaccine issues. We have to recognize that at this stage, unfortunately, many African low-income countries are left behind. I think, of course, vaccine rollout is being rolled out in many regions around the world, but that has not been the case yet in Africa. And I think this is something that symptomatic of a failure of global cooperation in some ways. I think there must have been, as many leaders called for before, there must have been a scheme, a global scheme for making sure that as soon as the vaccines are available, they can be actually deployed in low-income countries that may not necessarily have the means to access that or to produce those vaccines. So that's not the case yet, and I think this is a failure of international cooperation that needs to be addressed as soon as possible, because as everyone understands, if the virus is, or if in some part of the world people are not safe, no one around the world will be safe. So I guess this is something that we need to tackle. As I said earlier, of course, there are some global schemes that are envisaged, but at this stage they have not been materializing into effective access of African countries to vaccine, and certainly we are hoping this is going to be the case soon. On the debt issues, I think you certainly had a good characterization of the issue. Is that when you talked about whether there is a piecemeal approach to debt, I certainly would agree with you on that. Why? I think we have to certainly very much welcome the initiative that the global community has taken to provide debt service standstill to low-income countries. I think the debt service suspension initiative that Ehan was talking about earlier has been instrumental in helping many of those countries address their liquidity pressures, and that was certainly very much welcome. But I think that it has not certainly involve private creditors doing their part, certainly reduce its effectiveness as far as African countries are concerned. And as we all know, debt service standstill can help ease liquidity pressure, but they would not necessarily actually help address solvency problems. And when you look at some African countries that are in tight debt situations or that are debt distress, certainly a debt service standstill alone is not enough. And I think they would expect from their partners, their global partners, actually more bold initiative to help them actually relieve their debt situation and make sure that they can restore debt sustainability. And certainly that would require a number of steps that still have yet to be taken by of course, partners. First of all, you have to make sure that for those countries that are in need of debt restructuring, they can actually access deep debt cuts as part of those discussions. I think whenever they benefit from small cuts, this is certainly not a way to resolve the problem in a permanent manner, in the sense that it's only sort of delay the reckoning. So I guess having some debt restructuring operation that can help them actually definitely get back on a sound footing would be certainly very much welcome. That's for sure. But of course, we have to recognize that there are still some weaknesses in legal frameworks when it comes to debt restructuring that needs to be addressed for this operation to really bear the type of fruits that are expected from them. And I believe institutions like the IMF and of course other multilateral institutions may need to work further in terms of finding the solution to successful debt restructuring operation. So I guess, and that's where I would conclude, we need a bold effort from the international community to certainly help address unsustainable debts in some part of the world, particularly in some African countries. Of course, we recognize also actually it's a primary responsibility for African countries themselves to find also as much as possible some internal solution to the problem, including by increasing their capacity to mobilize domestic revenue, but also including steps to improve public expenditure management. But at the end of the day, even if they do that, they will still be in need of additional external financing, and that's where some of those countries that are under debt pressure needs the help of their partners to find effective solution. And when I talk about partners, I'm not only talking about public sector officials, I'm also talking about
also the private sector. Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Dauda. I think we're running a little bit over time, and I am going to try and bring this to close now. But I want to say, Arhan, thank you very much for really laying out both clearly and I think in a very direct and honest way, what is the outlook that we now see here, and recognizing that in your presentation that there is a pretty somber outlook, even without taking into account a series of downside risks, many of which are getting close to becoming part of the baseline. And frankly, if you bring them into the baseline for all the reasons that people have talked about, whether it's pandemic, vaccines, or whether it's debt problems, or whether it's the willingness of policymakers or the ability of policymakers in developing countries to take some of the tough measures after a year when their populations are already getting a little bit fed up with the situation, is all of these I think are there, and so I know we have this annual discussion, but I'm kind of tempted, Ayhan, to say that in this year, perhaps a mid-year update, just to see how things are going with the same panel, might not be a bad thing for us to aim for. So if you allow us, we might try and set something up for the middle of the year where we can take stock. So thanks to you. Thanks to all our panelists, Anne-Marie, Liliana, Dauda, for your perceptive and insightful comments as well. And thank you to all of you who have been listening patiently to this interaction. I hope you found it useful.
Thank you.